was expelling Jews. And when this band of Jews arrives, the governor of the colony at the time, a man named Peter Stuyvesant, is furious, and he writes that he does not want such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ to enter his domain, and he seeks to expel them, to say you can't settle here. While he's doing that, the Jews who have arrived petition the Dutch West India Company, which is the holding company of the colony, and the company leaders communicate to Stuyvesant that the Jews really need to be allowed to stay because they have connections to shareholders, to important Jewish shareholders in the company, and those shareholders and their dollars are necessary for colonial ventures. But they sort of throw a bone to Stuyvesant and they say, quote, "The poor among them shall not become a burden to the company or to the community, but be supported by their own nation." Now, it's interesting because on the face of it, there's nothing very Golden Land-like about this story, right? The Jews are told to leave and then they can stay because they have money. Yet, it becomes engulfed in a Golden Land narrative, affirmed in 1954 when American Jews celebrate the tercentennial, and again in 2004 when they celebrated the 350th. But it only happened by myopically implanting this story in a myth of American and Jewish exceptionalism. First, the way the story's been told really obscures the practices of empire and Jews' participation in them, and American roots of a kind of imperialism, an imperial framework. So well before and after 1654, Jews had had contact with the New World, and they were not intent on gaining permanent settlement rights there or achieving civil status. This was not their aim, and it's not really clear it was the aim of this group that ended up arriving there. They were really just asking to sort of be allowed to stay there for a while. And so in that regard, the terms of their acceptance as connected to a colonial company and being part of the shareholders of it made perfect sense. They were part of a colonial endeavor like other Europeans. And most Jews who were involved in that moved in and out of the New World as part of a colonial order. They were not seeking to gain full rights. But the way the story's been told is if this is the sort of beginning of the New World offering a different kind of acceptance or tolerance of Jews, has shorn off the historical context to define this as a starting point of toleration of Jews in the New World, or to suggest that something about their status here was distinctive from other imperial contexts, when in fact, in this origin point, it really was not. But second, the story has been rendered as a celebration of American voluntarism and toleration. And that part of the story became really important to Jewish leaders in the late 19th century who recovered this story, who had a kind of growing sense of looking to the past of American Jewish life to try to make sense of the moment they were living in, and also to offer some kind of legitimation or justification to explain why the prejudices that they were experiencing were not really consistent with an American tradition of accepting Jews. So they go to this story, which would seem to really do the opposite, right? It didn't seem to help. But they find belonging in exclusion. And they do so in material ways through voluntarism, right? So they talk about how this moment of the so-called Stuyvesant promise became such a core principle of American Jewish communal life because it allowed Jews both to be tolerated in the United States and also to create those institutions that would take care of their own. That in fact, this was something that was a really praiseworthy principle of American life because groups could remain distinctive, but also would have a certain level of toleration. And the moralizing force of this interpretation, I think, has really stuck with us in some ways that are, frankly, a bit pernicious. The idea that through self-reliance and pluck, any group should be able to outrun xenophobia. And those groups that don't seem to achieve this are not doing enough to prove their merit and to prove that they're not a burden. So lauding voluntarism as the way any group can simply enter American civic life and believing that good works lead to toleration, all of this became central to the Golden Land story. And it flattened much of the actual history of 1654 and what we might learn from it. So if 1654, interpreted in this way, set the kind of exceptional promise of the Golden Land in motion, By 1790, it takes off. Not actually in 1790, but in the interpretations of 1790. And this is the kind of second origin point that's often pointed to in American Jewish history. And it involves a set of correspondence between Jews in Newport, Rhode Island, and the new president of the United States, George Washington. And the words that maybe some of you are familiar with, that the president writes to this Jewish community in Rhode Island, for happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Right? These words are the piece of them about bigotry, no sanction, persecution, no assistance, were unfurled on the facade of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, and they're trotted out as very important words that were bestowed upon a Jewish community by the first president. But again, the story belies its more layered and honest meaning. The words themselves were actually authored by the warden of the synagogue, a man named Moses Satius, who presented them as part of a congratulatory letter to the president, who was making a kind of victory tour after being elected, and was going to lots of communities, churches, and some synagogues. And the congregation presents this letter to him and uses those words. And when read in their original context, they actually bespeak a kind of anxiety, an apologetic, and asking or pleading for tolerance in return for being good citizens. And in a sense, Washington just sort of retweets them, right? And it's not clear if the answer he gives is entirely affirmative because of the context in which he gives the answer. In 1790, as he's visiting all these different congregations and towns and cities in the United States, the Congress had just passed the first Naturalization Act, and it defined citizenship through those who were eligible for it, free white persons, and by persons they meant men. So this was a kind of liberal vision on one hand, that free white people, that any person who was sort of assumed to be really a person could be a citizen. But it absolutely tolerated exclusion. It had exclusion written into it. Women, non-Christian, slaves, many free black people, indigenous people, none of them could be citizens. So it was a liberal vision kind of without any teeth. In part because also the federal government actually had very little control over citizenship. It generally was something that was adjudicated at the state level and even at like localities, cities, and towns. So the question of whether Jews would be included in this legal infrastructure of belonging depended on whether they'd be slotted into excluded categories and depended on local realities, right? And we know that many states had established Christian churches well into the 19th century, demanded Christian oaths for political service, limited Jewish economic rights. So the fact that Washington might, kind of take these words and offer them back to the Jewish community didn't necessarily say much about the quality of their effective citizenship in the country. So in other words, the answer was often no, that Jews were not vested with full rights of legal personhood. But how does this exchange become so core to the Golden Land story? Well, it's similar to what happens with 1654. Almost 100 years after Washington visits this Newport synagogue and they exchange these letters, an organization is founded called the American Jewish Historical Society. And it was founded by 41 fairly elite men with the explicit purpose of unearthing history of Jewish contributions to the United States in order to show that Jews had been accepted from the beginning, and in order to dispel prejudice as being un-American, right? As being inconsistent with the fundamental truths of what this country was about. So they're looking for, in part, a kind of counter-history to the exclusions that they were witnessing around them, to say, look, what you are seeing, this is the late 19th century, we could list all sorts of things, right, that are happening in the United States, rise in populist movement, immigration, restrictions starting to be on the horizon, xenophobia, nativism, the total dismantling of the Reconstructionist era, right? So they're seeing a world around them that is marked by so many exclusions, And yet they're trying to sort of find and will into being an American history of Jews really belonging. And so in that context, they take those letters that have been tucked in a file somewhere for 100 years, and they publish them in their journal. And they start to publish them in textbooks, and they start to kind of do a PR campaign for them. And I think in the early 1940s, there's this freedom train thing that goes throughout the United States as the Bill of Rights and other important documents, right? And this letter is on the freedom train, right? Which is like this incredible way in which history can be reinvented in all sorts of ways and serve a very presentist purpose. So what do we learn from these Golden Land origin stories? One thing we see, I think, is the labor and the revisionist energy that went into creating the Golden Land story. How it was a story about aspiration, and how it tilted what I would call the interpretive mechanisms of history, right? In these cases, it attempted to draw a very sharp, stark line of division between America and global and historical forces, especially around themes of empire and imperialism. It attempted to untangle Jews' history in this country from the histories of other groups that faced persistent exclusions. And it attempted to define America by its stated ideals as opposed to its practices. So the Golden Land became a kind of interpretive mechanism that really became the basis of my field of American Jewish history. So not to apologize for my own sense of feeling flat-footed about how to explain what the hell has been going on in our country, but my field and the very sort of foundation of it was steeped in these narratives, in these acts of recovery to make this proof about Jews belonging in this country. And I think we really do see this at play in how historical depictions of maybe some familiar episodes of anti-Semitism, how they've kind of played out, how they've been rendered. So I want to give one example. Maybe this is something that is a bit familiar to you, at least the kind of vague contours of it, but I'm going to tell you maybe a little more about it than you know. So this is an example from 1877, and it involves a man named Joseph Seligman, who was a Bavarian-born banker and a business person. And in 1877, in May, he goes to check into this very fancy hotel, the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs, New York. And he's been doing this for decades. He's been going to this hotel for a very long time. But that year, the manager says to him, "I'm sorry, there are no rooms. You have to leave." Seligman presses, and he's told, "You have to leave. We're no longer interested in having Jews stay at our hotel." This leads to major press fanfare, right? You can go online, you can find all of these headlines about this, and this is because Seligman was a very prominent, wealthy person. It's not because this was an odd thing to happen. Now, historians have persisted, and I am sure one could find in my own writing the same thing, in describing this incident as the epitome of social anti-Semitism, as a private slight, a kind of private exclusion. But if you go to the press coverage at the time, you see something really different, which is that this was described as something having to do with the legal status of Jews in this country. Civil rights in peril is what the headline to one paper proclaims. Another asked, "Civil rights for Jews?" So in fact, the manager's actions violated New York State law and Federal Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited places of accommodation from excluding people based on race, color, or prior servitude. And it prohibited their exclusion from public accommodations, including hotels, pools, trains, and so on. A San Francisco newspaper explained, "The hotel, while managed for private gain, is in a qualified sense a public institution." So therefore, at the time, this was understood as a civil rights issue, as an issue that broke civil rights legislation, and as something that had to do with the legal status of Jews. It wasn't just understood as a snub. So as such, Seligman prepares to file suit, and the hotel prepares a defense. And what the defense is that the manager had not excluded Seligman because of his belonging in a protected class. The manager says he was not visibly Jewish. I didn't think that I was doing it because he was Jewish, despite the fact that it seems materially that that is what he said. but that he actually excluded Seligman, he says, simply because he was undesirable, right? So he says, I didn't do it, he was not wearing the things that somebody who's being Jewish as a religion, as a protected group, would do. He was just being undesirable, right? And I can make that determination. What's interesting is the same logic has been used, and at the time was used by segregationists to justify the exclusion of black people from public accommodation, as if the prejudice was just about private preference and nothing more, nothing actionable. And this defense, though, ironically, has guided American Jewish historians' interpretations. They, in fact, have accepted it. Yeah, it was because this guy thought this other guy was undesirable. It was a private thing. It was a social snub. At the time, Seligman's attorneys were ready to refuse it. But then, kind of right as the suit seems to be moving forward, Seligman decides to pull it. And it's not entirely clear all the reasons why, but there are a few. His brothers or his business partners dissuade him from suing. They worry that despite the fact they think they have statutory grounds, the court would balk and the suit would fail, and this would look bad for their business and bad for Jews. And there's evidence that they're uncomfortable, and they're told by other Jewish community leaders that they should be uncomfortable about drawing public attention to anti-Semitism as a civil rights violation akin to anti-black racism. They did not want to be classed in the same legal terrain or in the same inferior status. The aborted suit and historians' neglect of it enabled the interpretive mechanism of the Golden Land narrative to continue. So the dominant interpretation of this event by far is that it is simply a case of social exclusion, of kind of private, or what is often called social anti-Semitism. It was marginal to the political and legal landscape of the country's commitment to equality. And this interpretation has reigned supreme. It's how historians would have explained what happened to my dad as mere social anti-Semitism, which is also how I understood it when I learned that category. This episode, like my dad's experience, was removed from questions maybe we should have been asking that also might help us navigate our current moment. So at the time of Seligman's experience, for example, how was it related to the Jim Crow system rising, right? How was it related to immigration restriction efforts that were rising? How was it connected to budding forces of eugenicist thought that were justifying social hierarchy as natural and good? Instead of confronting legal and political dimensions of American anti-Semitism and their imbrication with other systems of exclusion, this was, instead of being confronted, this was actually used by historians somehow to explain that at the kind of base of it, American liberalism was still enduring, that these were the kinds of exceptions, right? And one of the main historians who writes about the Seligman episode talks about it as an anomaly, as the sort of, I hate this phrase, the exception that proves the rule, right? That this actually proves that for the most part, American liberalism really did work. And that there was merely this kind of social and private anti-Semitism that was inexorably diminishing. Why was this interpretation so accepted? Why did people, not just historians of American Jews, but also American Jewish leaders, become so committed to it? And I think there are a few reasons. One is that it offered a way to protest anti-Semitism on some level without having to reckon with the extent to which nativism, racism, and exclusion were central to the American fabric, and without having to see the connection between Jews' status and other excluded Americans. So I think that's part of what it did. It helped isolate the issue. And instead, they could attack anti-Semitism as an individual problem, to be solved through individual efforts of education, not through law, and often behind-the-scenes maneuvers. But the Golden Land narrative wasn't just a way for Jews to write themselves into the American story and sort of will their acceptance. But the messier truth of it is that it has also served the interests of American power structures, and especially the American racial order. So what's the relationship? And this is where I'll kind of end us, and then we'll be happy to take questions. What's the relationship between the Golden Land narrative and the logic of whiteness in this country? So a core component of this Golden Land narrative became expressed in the 20th century through the language and logic of whiteness. By narrating anti-Semitism as a social or private force, apart from Jews' legal and political standing, American Jews, in fact, really smoothed their way into fitting into the contours of whiteness and gained some acceptance by telling this kind of narrative. So the first half of the 20th century is really marked by self-conscious efforts to restrain Jewish voices that wanted to more vocally protest American anti-Semitism in favor of those voices that wanted to deal with it in back-channel ways. And I could give you lots of examples of that. Well, still sort of dealing with the kind of private individual level, dealing on these back-channel kind of ways, but still trying to prove the kind of stability of Jews belonging in the United States. And by 1967, when James Baldwin writes a kind of famous and biting New York Times essay, he titles it, "Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white." So this is clearly a kind of biting way of framing it, but his narrative ironically reflects the story that American Jews had been telling about themselves, about their ability to fit into the core, into the center of America. And one of the really interesting things that comes out in this same period is the effort to define what was called a kind of new anti-Semitism, and sometimes you hear this verbiage used even today. And anti-Semitism to describe when various groups that are interested in opposing structures of oppression and hegemony, white supremacy, and certain forms of colonial or imperial power, when those groups apprehended Jews as part of those structures, which, to be clear, that was part of the fruits of the Golden Land narrative, then Jews in the late 20th century call this out as new anti-Semitism, right? When this Golden Land narrative sort of succeeds too much, there's this effort to kind of call out what some people are doing by associating Jews with white privilege and power and supremacy, or whatever the vocabulary is that you want to use to call that out. Jews respond to that by saying this is a new form of anti-Semitism. And that language, I've become really interested in the new anti-Semitism. The label conflates Black, Muslim, and leftist critiques of power as one, all being the same, and two, smacking of anti-Semitism. The term new anti-Semitism attempted to draw a line between Jews and those groups that were excluded from Western and white power, which is what the Golden Land narrative, in a sense, had attempted to do. And the term itself is designated it as troubling, as indeed anti-Semitic, when excluded groups identified Jews with Western and white power, which was part of what the Golden Land narrative was itself trying to do. So in other words, in new anti-Semitism, the problem was with those excluded from the Golden Land, not the Golden Land. So in conclusion, I want us to think together about how we can tell and use history more honestly and responsibly. And today I'm struck by the dizzying efforts to talk about what is history and the uses of history, and also to combat anti-Semitism, and how these both often rest on really benighted, enfeebled historical interpretive frameworks that refuse to see how anti-Semitism is stitched into the illiberal structures that thread through American liberalism. And that anti-Semitism in the United States is not simply the private or social exclusions endured by people, but it's part of the political and legal infrastructure of our country. And it should be a way, I think, in thinking this way and in being able to sort of challenge how we think about that Golden Land narrative. Perhaps that will allow us to reframe what it means when we talk about combating anti-Semitism and we talk about the history of Jews in this country. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions, comments, disagreements.
We're gonna run the microphone around, so thanks for your patience. We have folks who are joining us in the room. We have folks who are also joining us on our stream. And so for the folks at home to be able to hear the questions and the responses, it will be helpful if you can wait for the microphone to come to you. So thanks for using your hands, and thanks for asking questions, and thanks for waiting for the mic.
That was great. how would you connect your thoughts on the new anti-Semitism to Moshe Postone's thesis that anti-Semitism has to do with an identification of Jews with capitalism?
Right, so there's a whole layer. So I'm using the shorthand of American liberalism, but I think that, if we really get into understanding how liberalism works in the United States, in part it is a defense of capitalism, right? Because it's a defense of the idea of individual rights and individual private property. And so, part of the question of how, kind of writing Jews through this Golden Land narrative into American liberalism and into American capitalism, how does that become a sort of identification with ideologies that don't necessarily solve the problem of Jewishness, but in a certain way kind of push at some of the places where Jews are associated with frameworks of oppression, like capitalism, like private property, right? I mean, and one could think about this through Marx's On the Jewish Question, right? This 1844 essay where not necessarily in the most palatable terms, he is in part making this argument, right, that the kind of over-identification of Jewishness with capitalism and with liberalism is not really about Jews per se, right? It's about these structures of capitalism and liberalism. And to solve this problem is not about emancipating Jews into liberalism. It's about emancipating humanity into something that's not liberalism and not capitalism. Whether that's an answer, we could talk about.
One of the comments when you say about liberalism is the challenge that Jews have had, not just in America, but worldwide, where in most cases, the only way that we've been able to survive is by showing our importance to the countries where we've been in, whether not through goods that we've been able to make, sell, distribute, whatever, and we've always worked up. We've had, you can look back in history, you see various periods where, Jews were considered part of the whole community. There was no stigma, but then things came about, and again, they were found to be picked on as being the problem children to be there.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about your father, Semitism didn't end in 52, it didn't end in 55, it's still around. When I left college, there were businesses that I knew I couldn't join, that would never hire me. Okay? So it isn't something that, they're looking at us, when you try to put and say, from a liberalism perspective that's anti-communist, all they're doing is just finding a reason. It still doesn't stop the fact that there's anti-Semitism and you're picking on a group or not a group. I'm not sure I'm liking the context that you're putting things into.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. So what I hear you saying is actually one of the theories that some historians put forward, right? Which is that there is a kind of eternal anti-Semitism. And so you want to dance around the context, whatever, but there's a certain availability of Jewishness to be the thing that rises to the top when people need an explanation. So I wouldn't 100% subscribe to that as good history. I think that it does, give some explanation for why there is that kind of availability of Jewishness. Like, so, even people, we were just talking about this at my dinner table, right? Even people who might not necessarily know what the swastika is or something like that might end up sort of using it as a symbol of their rage or a symbol of what they think is wrong. And they, there's an availability to it, right? So I think that is one explanation. I think, though, if we denude anti-Semitism of any kind of historical context, I think that it ends up being like a fundamentally fatalistic kind of approach, right? And if we're trying to ask on some level, right, and I guess I have a shred of optimism left in me, right, like what kinds of human systems and structures would allow people to feel more in solidarity with people who are not exactly like them? I think we have to keep pressing at those questions of the legal systems, of the political system, of the ideologies, and you know how they answer these kinds of persistent problems, because it's not just anti-Semitism, right? There's all other sorts of nativism and racism and whatever. So that's why I come to this thinking that eternalist explanation always has to be paired at least with a contextualist one.
I have sort of a historiographic question, I guess. A lot of what you're saying seems very familiar from what I remember reading of people writing about American, 19th century nativism, or something like Matt Jacobson's Whiteness of a Different Color, 20 years ago. So I guess, can you talk a little bit more about how American Jewish history has a different history than American history or American social and legal history, and how, because to me some of what your project seems to be doing is bringing American Jewish history closer to the mainstream of American history.
Yes, thank you. So one thing that's interesting about Matt was one of my dissertation advisors. Did you have him in college? Okay. So one thing I think that's interesting about work like that, so this is a Yale professor who wrote about ideas of whiteness, and was sort of like one of the few Americanists who didn't define himself as doing American Jewish history, who just sort of as a matter of course included discussions about Jews in his effort to sort of historicize whiteness. But part of what's interesting about what even Matt does is Jews are the ones who are sort of resolved by whiteness, right? So in part, I am trying to say, look, American Jewish history, I think, has had a kind of attachment to narratives of exceptionalism and triumphalism that were really, they were part of American history, certainly in the Cold War era, but were really challenged by the New Left and challenged by historians of the 60s and 70s and 80s. And American Jewish history didn't really experience that for all sorts of reasons we could talk about. So absolutely, I am trying to kind of push it more to say, like, let's be in conversation with kind of broader historiographic pieces of American history, but I'm also trying to push American history too. Yeah, so you got it.
Hi. I know that here in Maryland we had the Jew laws, Jew codes that were very much a response to, I guess the Catholic statement and the fact that we weren't allowed. Can you speak to why that mentality of allyship, because I know it was a man from Western Maryland that actually advocated and went to court for it, why that wasn't extended to Native and Black Americans or non-Americans at that time, but were to the Jews?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So there are these laws that were not allowing non-Protestants basically to hold office, right, in the state of Maryland, and Maryland was not alone in this. And every year for a while there would be something sort of presented to the state Congress to say, like, let's get rid of this. And there was certainly allyship among Jews and Catholics and other kinds of religious dissenters about trying to advocate for more religious tolerance, right? And so why doesn't that translate to, efforts of allyship or solidarity with other forms of excluded groups? Well, what we find in American history is that efforts to make common cause along the axis of religion have tended not to kind of filter out to other axes of exclusion. Sometimes they have, right? We have some examples of it. But part of it does seem to be a kind of scarcity mentality, that there is a scarce amount of tolerance, right? And if you want it, you're going to be very strategic about with whom you make your argument and who's part of the kind of alliance. And so in the late 19th and early 20th century, the kind of invention of the idea of the Judeo-Christian, right, is part of kind of weaving Jews and Catholics and Protestants together one of the most notable things about that vocabulary is it's just not interested in Black Americans, right? And part of it is like the balance can work to bring in Irish Catholics who are excluded, and Italian Catholics who are excluded, and Jews who are excluded, and you know, these liberal social gospel Protestants are like, okay. And there's just this sense that like, if we extend this logic, which really should be extended because it's this logic of exclusion, right, to other groups that are excluded, we're not going to win this battle, right? It was, in a way, it's sort of similar to why Seligman's like, I don't actually want that civil rights protection because I don't want to look like this group, and it speaks to the power of some of these lines of you know what racial designations mean in this country.
This is just a history question. The 2017 event in Charlottesville, Unite the Right, was sparked by anger over plans to remove Confederate monuments. How did that occasion the opportunity to morph into an anti-Semitic event with shouts of Jews shall not replace this?
That would take a long time to explain. Except it's that these logics of exclusion, on one hand, respect and operate on these different axes, right? Of black and white, of who is considered in or out of a particular religious tradition, of respectability, whatever those lines are. But they also can kind of run roughshod over those lines, right? And so, part of the kind of the analogies, in a way, that are sanctioned by exclusionary thought tend to sort of see lots of different groups of people as all being part of this kind of problem of taking away power from the group that believes it's meant to be in power, right? That it's supposed to be dominant. So these ideas of like all these different kinds of groups that are fundamentally victimizing or threatening the power of this, kind of white, very angry, sort of reactionary group has this ability to sort of analogize itself through all sorts of different groups. And what's interesting is like, this is how even American legal thinking about citizenship operated for a long time, right? Like who were the groups that could be in, who were the groups that could be out, trying to sort of analogize groups to other groups and understand them through one another. So I think that there's a way in which that sort of exclusionary thinking jumps over lines of different groups, right? And so all of these groups that are sort of, perceived as trying to ask for inclusion become the source of what this kind of white reactionary group believes is threatening it. So I think that that's at least a piece of it. And that, and then there's the availability of Jewishness, right? What we were talking about before, and the kinds of tropes that are associated with it. There's so many different kind of layered ways, I think, to think about that. And people who talk about replacement theory talk about all of those layers. There's a lot to say there. So I'm not sure how to organize like more of an answer than that, but it's a good question.
I think we'll take 2 more questions.
Thank you. So it's actually very similar to that question. There's a thinker I have in mind, Eric K. Ward. He's you're familiar, good. So, a black civil rights activist out of Los Angeles, did a lot of work dealing with the neo-Nazi movement and the skinhead movement in Southern California. And his sort of response to that question is that what it means to be anti-black in America has shifted in the late 20th century. And looking back at your original project of how did anti-Semitism change from the 50s anti-Semitism to now, do you feel like your work is connected to that? Do you have any sort of connections between how you're trying to answer the question from the Jewish framework to how thinkers like him are answering the question from the black framework, and can you speak on that?
Yeah, he's wonderful, and if you haven't read his Skin in the Game, it's really worth reading. I think in many ways, we are thinking in very similar kinds of streams, right? And I'm influenced by him, that what he is saying is that anti-Black racism in this country is not an island, right? It has a particular history and particular context and vocabularies that are deployed to use it in forms of violence and laws and policies that have been used to enact it, but that it participates in and justifies other forms of exclusion. There's a historian, George Frederickson, who talks about liberalism as always being able to come up with special reasons for exclusion, right? And so, part of what Ward is essentially saying is that it's not really possible to separate anti-immigration sentiment, anti-LGBTQ sentiment, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, because these are all sort of drawn from this well that there's something that makes it legitimate sometimes to exclude people, right? And I mean, and that is a fundamental piece of any kind of nation-state sovereignty, right? There are people who are in, there are people who are out, and the kinds of efforts over and over to explain what that logic is for exclusion have the ability to kind of like cast a wide net and operate for and justify the exclusion of all sorts of groups of people, right? And so I actually think that, that particular insight is not just explaining anti-Black racism, and in fact, part of what Ward is doing, what I find powerful about what he's doing, is he's trying to show how, in a white nationalist imagination, there's really not that much of a difference between anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. These things can sort of easily morph one into the other. And that's that you will not replace us, Jews will not replace us, like in motion. And so to really understand that kind of logic and how it's baked into American laws and policies is to understand why, there's a historian in American Jewish history who always used to say that anti-Semitism wasn't a big deal in this country because it was crowded out by anti-Black racism. He continues to say this. And what Ward says, and from the work I'm doing and some others, that's just not the case, it's the opposite. And I think that's what's really powerful about Ward's work.
So Jews are not monolithic. Some are very assimilated and look like everybody else and sound like everybody else, all the mainstream white culture. And then there are groups that are very separate and intentionally look different in terms of their clothing and personal habits and language that they use. And how has that changed over time, thinking of the 50s to now? And then how does that fit into this sort of golden land narrative?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll just say a couple of things because I want to make sure, I know time is tight, I think, at this point, but, and it's a question that really could have a very big answer. But one thing is that part of what this golden land narrative, I think, has done is it has really centered the kind of Ashkenazi Jewish experience as a quintessential American Jewish experience. And one piece of that is, again, like everything else that I was saying about these kinds of disavowals, it is not incorrect or indefensible because the vast majority of Jews who have been in the United States have been Jews of Ashkenazi descent. Okay, that is empirically the case. However, it does not mean, therefore, that to understand the experience of Jews in this country, one should only study that group of people. And it doesn't mean that the experiences that other Jews who are not Ashkenazi Jews, who don't present as being able to, as you said, sort of in certain situations kind of fit into or pass or whatever the vocabulary would be as other white Americans, it doesn't mean that the treatment or the way those Jews are approached has nothing to do with how other Jews are perceived, right? So even when we think about, and I think maybe one thing that was in your mind is the rising population of Haredi Jews in this country, right? Who, unlike Seligman, who the manager says, I didn't know, part of what they're doing is inscribing on their bodies through their garb their Jewishness. And what we see in that is that does affect the status and the kind of perception of Jews more generally, right? It creates a way in which Jewishness has a different kind of visibility. So one of the pieces that is interesting to me about trying to kind of pull apart this Golden Land narrative is to ask, like, whose voices and whose experiences have been dismissed as not core to the American Jewish experience because it doesn't fit in with this, right? And so I think it has been at times very religious Jews. I think it's been very politically radical Jews, except for, you know, a kind of Yiddish culture edge has been okay, but not some of the most political radical pieces of them. And I think it has been non-Ashkenazi Jews, right? You know, some of whom were not able to become citizens of this country, which is in total defiance of the story that American Jews were never had to be emancipated. They were, you know, just citizens upon arrival, right? And so it does sort of pull apart at the different axes of exclusion, and it's a really, really important question, I think.
So please join me in saying thank you to everyone. I'm going to say that Dr. Berman had an enviable task at the beginning of her remarks to kind of bridge the very spiritual, emotive experience that we had in our new courtyard to coming in talking about this fairly heavy topic. Having said that, I imagine, one, this topic is very much on our minds because of a lot that's been happening, but certainly also the 4-year anniversary of the shooting in Pittsburgh just yesterday, and some of you may have seen already the HBO documentary about this. Miriam had a chance to watch it, I have not yet. But I actually think that this evening stitched together some of the best aspects of Beth Am, which is these spiritually uplifting gatherings, communally relevant experiences where we come together of different ages and stages of life to just joyfully engage in our Judaism together, and the rigor of intellectual curiosity and exploration that's really at the heart of being a learning community. So I want to thank you for bringing us into that right now. Dr. Berman is going to continue on this weekend. As you know, we have entered our year of Tzedek, a topic explored today through the question of anti-Semitism and how it fits into the American landscape. But we'll continue tomorrow as she speaks during our service, the Devar Torah, about individual and collective responsibility. After Kiddush lunch, she'll speak about philanthropy and responsibility and how philanthropy acts as a force of justice, but also perhaps perpetuating inequalities as well. And then in the evening, we'll gather technically after Shabbos, but we're kind of calling it a, Sudash Lishit Malava Malka. We'll have a chance to get together for some bagels and some light fare at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. We'll meet here in the Beit Midrash, and Dr. Berman will speak about American sort of experiences of urbanism, cosmopolitanism, some of her research from Detroit. I'll react to that a little bit and share some of what we've learned here in Baltimore and Central West Baltimore at Beth Am and how it may or may not track with her research, and we'll have a chance to open it up for conversation, questions from all of you as well. So I think it's going to be a wonderfully diverse and compelling Shabbat together with Lila, Corwin, Berman. Thanks for being here tonight. One housekeeping measure, as I mentioned before, DIY congregations. So folks, the tables could use to be bussed, and we would be grateful for your assistance in doing that before you leave. If you brought a coat, don't forget it from the coat room. Let's make sure that everybody gets to their cars safely. Once again, thank you so much to Dr. Berman for your presentation this evening. And Shabbat Shalom.